Hi, I'm Eliza Collins, and I cover Congress for USA Today, and I'm here with my colleague, Deborah Barfield-Berry, who also covers Congress with me. The two of us were in the House chamber tonight to watch President Donald Trump give his second State of the Union address. It's his second because the first year you actually do not give a State of the Union when you're president. So there was lots going on in there.
Indeed.
But let's start actually not with Trump, but with the Democratic response. Stacey Abrams was chosen by Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer. Republicans have the majority, but she was chosen to give the response. Can you explain who she is?
Sure. Stacey Abrams ran for governor in Georgia. She lost that bid against the Secretary of State, but for a lot of Democrats, she kind of symbolized a new era, if you will, of more women running for offices, particularly more women of color running for offices. So in a lot of ways, Senator Schumer said that she was an inspiration. So they thought it would probably be a good move to have her in particular as a counter or a response to Donald Trump.
And she came following Democrats took back the House on a record number of women and diverse women. The Democratic Party is getting more and more diverse and more female. Meanwhile, the Republicans actually lost women in the House. They did gain some seats in the Senate. But that was really clear tonight. We were seated basically behind the president and the vice president and the Speaker of the House looking out at the chamber. And I mean, explain what it looks like out there.
Very stark contrast between the Democratic side of the chamber. Very stark contrast between the Democratic side of the chamber and the Republican side of the chamber. On the Democratic side of the chamber, you had a lot more women. A lot more diversity. You had women wearing white in honor of the suffrage. And then you had, on the other side, you had Republicans, many more white men and many more people in dark suits, and then a sprinkling of Republican women. Most of them were wearing red and or pink, but it was definitely a smaller number than it used to be because they lost several seats last year. Yeah,
they did lose seats. And really quickly, if you're watching on Facebook, comment in your questions. We will try our very best to answer them. Looking out there, it was a very stark difference. I mean, last year, Democrats actually dressed in black, Democratic women dressed in black as sort of in a symbol of the Me Too movement. And we saw white has come up before during the president's inauguration. Hillary Clinton wore a white pantsuit when she secured the Democratic nomination for president. But because there were so many more women, it made such a difference because it really was most of the chamber. But there was a moment before this we were talking about. The moment that we both think will probably come to define the State of the Union. What was that?
That's when, at one point, President Trump talked about the record number of women in Congress, which made the Democratic women go wild. Jump out of their seats, do high fives, fist bumps. And laughing and pointing, because if anything, it symbolized the fact that, number one, there were a record number of women. Most of them were Democrats.
The record number of women were Democratic women.
And the freshman class is the most diverse it's ever been. Yeah,
Republicans lost women and got one new freshman Republican woman. And at one point I think at first he was maybe taken aback because he talked about, more women have jobs than ever. And then a few of the women lawmakers in the front turned around and pointed at the lawmakers behind them, basically saying, you guys have the jobs. And then once that sort of kind of like resonated, people started jumping up and like shouting. And then the president said, don't sit down, you'll like what I have to say next. And that was the record number of lawmakers. And then the really crazy thing was then the Democrats started chanting USA. USA, USA. And then the Republicans
jumped up and started chanting it with them. So that was one of the, can we say, few bipartisan?
It was, but so it sounds like our producer Hannah says we have a question.
You do. Donald would like to know, where was RBG and what does it mean that he wasn't there, if anything at all? Do the justices always attend?
Yes, Donald's asking where Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg was tonight and what it means, if it's a symbol of anything, and do justices normally attend? So there were only 4 justices tonight. She was not one of them. But that is not abnormal. I actually looked this up before. So she did not attend last year, and only a handful of justices attended last year as well. It was actually a mix this year. Elena Kagan is of the more progressive wing, and then we had Gorsuch and Kavanaugh, who are more conservative, and then Roberts, who is sort of the center of the court. And it's really awkward for Supreme Court justices. We have a really good story on right now because they are not political.
Right.
Their leanings, how they rule, might be more conservative or progressive, but they are not going to like hoot and holler for immigration or abortion or border wall, like all of the things that really do elicit responses. And so they've said in the past that they don't like going, and some have just fully not gone for years and years. Ginsburg did not go last year. She was recovering because she got surgery last month. She actually was seen out last night at an event. It was her first public appearance, but she did not come tonight. I would not read too much into that because it's normal for justices not to come, and she's also recovering from illness, but was out in public last night. So, yeah, that was interesting. I mean, did anybody else stick out to you? Like, talk to me about the responses to when the president, we're talking about how it is political. Like, what is it like when Trump says something that is partisan?
Well, it was some clear moments during his speech where it was clear that Democrats weren't feeling it and weren't going to stand up, particularly when he started talking, especially when he started going to foreign policy. That was it. A lot of them were just sitting there, them meaning Democrats, were just sitting there staring. Some had their hands clasped or just not responding at all.
Right.
And particularly, there was one point, though, when he talked about the war, there would have been a, quote, major war if he weren't elected president with North Korea.
Yes.
I'm sorry, there would have been a major war with North Korea if he wasn't elected president. Some of them looked at each other, some of the Democrats looked at each other and just bust out laughing.
There was literally,
They
laughing.
just laughed. Now, Republicans, on the other hand, stood up many times when he talked about the economy, when he talked about the unemployment rate for African Americans, how it's dropped, when he talked about ag, trade. There were many points. Immigration,
the
borders,
wall.
the wall.
Yeah.
There were many times where they stood up, clapped, cheered, talked to U.S., chanted USA. But those were the clear issues where they kind of parted ways.
And it is really normal for parties to basically the opposing party to sit on their hands, so to speak, and the party in power to jump up, clap, do standing ovations. But it is kind of awkward when the president says something like more people have jobs than ever or an economy. If you're a Democrat in that situation, or basically the opposing party, because of course they want to be applauding for new jobs, but it's basically the president taking credit for that. And that's something that goes back a long time, so it's always interesting to watch. Some sort of hesitate, some jump up right away. I will note that the ones that jump up right away are usually ones from districts that are competitive or that the president won. I was watching this little row in the back of new members who all had flip seats, and they were competitive seats. And it was really interesting because they would jump up all the time. Arizona Senator Kristen Sinema, that's a red state that flipped blue for the first time in a long time.
And Senator Manchin, he was in the front row, but he's from West Virginia, also more.
He's a more conservative
right?
Democrat.
And he was vulnerable. It was a very competitive race.
They both had really competitive races, and they both were up constantly. You know, the president talked about oil and gas. They were the only two Democrats who stood up on that.
And clapped on that.
So it is. It's just a really political moment, but there were some moments of bipartisanship, and I would argue more this year than last year. I don't know if do you agree?
I'm not sure about that last year, but I think there were some issues that kind of brought that up, and one of them in particular was criminal justice reform.
Yes. Deb's been covering this for a while.
Yeah, I've been covering it. Go to USA Today and read that. The president brought up the First Step Act, which is a criminal justice reform bill that Eliza and I wrote a lot about, actually, about how senators and House members worked together for years to make that happen. So it finally passed in December. The president signed it into law in December. And then one of the first, or several of the people who were in prison who were released under that act or that law actually were invited to be guests of President Trump. So when he brought it up, both sides stood up. When the person, Matthew Charles from Tennessee, stood up, everybody stood up and clapped and for him too, because it was, again, one of the few issues that elicited bipartisan support.
Yeah, and that was arguably the biggest legislative accomplishment that was bipartisan of the last Congress and of this president. So Trump did call for some new areas of bipartisanship in this Congress. Infrastructure, prescription drugs, those got a lot of applause.
From both sides.
And I've been talking to folks on that. I have a story coming out tomorrow. But it does sound like there's a lot of overlap. It's a really interesting thing. Everyone stood up and applauded that, the nation needs to rebuild their crumbling roads and bridges. But the problem comes with how to fund it, as often it does.
Right.
And so I think that it's really interesting to watch. In there's a real desire to get something done. And I think a lot of these Democrats that won districts that the president won, red districts, they need to get something done.
Right.
They cannot oppose the president on everything, or they will not be reelected. And they say that. I mean, I talked to Abigail Spanberger, one of the Democrats who stood up a lot tonight. She represents a district in Virginia. And she basically was saying, yeah, my district forces me to be more bipartisan because of who I represent. And she was looking into infrastructure, prescription drugs. So there are opportunities for bipartisanship. The president certainly called for it. But we have to talk about the elephant in the room that we just got out of a 35-day shutdown over a very partisan issue of immigration.
Over the wall.
Yeah.
And as soon as it came up, you could see the split right there in the chamber. The Republicans were jumping up, saying, clapping for the wall. Democrats just sat there and just stared. And it was clear that they weren't going to feel that.
Manchin clapped for the wall. I will note. But most people did not. And the government shut down for 35 days, the longest on record, because President Trump wants a wall along the southern border. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, who's sitting behind him. Yeah, and Democrats have been really united on that issue. So the government reopened, basically on a short-term basis. There's a bipartisan group of lawmakers trying to figure out a solution.
By the February 15th deadline.
Yes, so we're coming up on that. The president has basically teased that he might just declare a national emergency and what Congress is doing could be pointless, which also probably does not create a spirit of unity. So it's really interesting when he's in there, he's calling for unity. And this is also in the background. We just got out of this major government shutdown. Right.
Which is still hanging over everybody's head.
We didn't really get out of it.
Right, because it's still hanging over everybody's head. In fact, it's funny because a lot of the special guests that are invited, lawmakers get to invite a special guest for the State of the Union, and several of them, including Senator Wicker from Mississippi, who we talked to on our way in, had invited a Coast Guard fellow. And Coast Guard workers were some of the ones who were not being paid during the middle of the shutdown. So a lot of the members actually trying to salute, if you will, or honor those workers who were weren't being paid, and ask them to be special guests.
Right. And it was interesting because Wicker is a Republican.
He is.
He was honoring this guest, thanking him. Nobody likes government shutdowns. I think that is very clear.
They agree on that.
But Democrats brought in some workers to basically take a jab at the president. Stacey Abrams brought that up during her speech, the shutdown, as sort of more of a partisan, like saying that, the president blaming the president. Whereas Republicans who brought workers were more like, thank you for going this long without a paycheck here, come to this big moment. So I thought that was interesting, just the way that they approached inviting guests, even similar guests. Who are some other guests that you liked or thought were interesting?
Actually, again, on our way in, we talked to Senator John Kennedy from Louisiana, who actually brought custodian who works in the Senate Senate office building. He brought her as his guest, which was kind of a touching moment because she was really thrilled and tickled to be invited. So that was kind of a nice and different kind of touch.
And we caught them coming in, and he was like showing her around the Capitol. They were like a private tour.
Right.
So that was great. Well, this was a really interesting night.
It was.
And now we've got lots to unpack tomorrow. We've got just over a week until the government could shut down again. So,
right. And please go to USA Today and read some more of our stories. We have
Yeah.
plenty of coverage
So
from
much
the beginning to the end.
content.
All right.
All right. Have a good night.
Thank you for tuning in.